Good evening. My name is Dennis Genablaso from Community Access Tonight Show. And tonight we have Mr. William Marshall, an actor in the 50s and up to now. We'll get to him and we'll ask him what he's been doing. Mr. Marshall?
Good evening.
How you doing?
Not bad, thank you.
Okay, basically, we'd like to start asking what are you presently doing now? I understand you've just finished a tour.
Yes, I've been touring a play that I developed on the life of Frederick Douglass. It's a one-man, two-act play. Douglass, as you may know, was a slave born in 1817 in Maryland, and he escaped from slavery at the age of 20, went north to make his way in a relatively more civilized area of the country. And because, I guess, of his intense need to know how to read, he taught himself to read during slavery. It was prohibited very often by threats of death to teach a slave how to read, because that would do some damage to their economy, they felt, if they came to know why they were slaves and set about doing something about it, as Douglass did, and many others. He became an orator, or let's say a speaker, first for the American Anti-Slavery Society, and he made his first speech in 1841 in Nantucket. And he came to the attention of William Lloyd Garrison, who was one of the foremost speakers and workers in the liberation movement in the United States at that time. And Garrison became a mentor of his. Douglass began to evolve very quickly. He was extraordinarily sensitive, and
I believe he was really smart, too.
Yes, I think so. And, there's every evidence of that.
Basically, all the people, aside from the black people, thought that he might have been a threat to society.
Not all the people. Those who profited by the subjugation of people and owned bodies. Those who'd gone to the trouble of going all the way to Africa and subduing a people and dragging them back and planting them in various parts of the South and North also, and forcing them to work without pay. That condition lasted from 1619 until 1863, legally.
So basically the whole play is all about life and times of Frederick Douglass.
Frederick Douglass, again, beginning with the year of his birth, and I don't carry it to the end of his life, which would have been in 1895 at the age of 78. I take it to the acquisition of the 14th and 15th Amendment, which had to do with voting rights.
What made you decide to take up such a task, choosing of all the other heroes, black American heroes back then? What made you choose Frederick Douglass?
Well, he was the most significant of any of those that I'd come to know about in school or that I'd ever heard about. And during my early years, let's say my late teens in particular, we were hearing about him as being our greatest teacher. And I found that a rather natural pursuit to try and determine how a man of his sensitivity and brilliance, if you will, and courage, dealt with the question of slavery as compared to the rather second-class citizenship status of myself and my family and other families of the same clime, complexion, and degree. So I thought I'd learn from that, and upon learning, teach, just as did Douglass.
Do you think you'll basically come up with another play, or would you plan to take this particular play on the road again?
I've done some other one-man shows that could be considered plays. I've done an evening of Shakespearean heroes, and also an evening of the music and poetry of African-American people. The extension of the play will reveal itself ultimately as a motion picture, dealing again with the life and times. I've gotten some development monies for a film from the National Endowment for the Humanities, and I'm in the process of trying to develop a storyline and to secure a film writer in order to get the film written. Then after that comes the big job of getting the money for it. That's rather monumental, and then distribution and all that. But that's the long-range plan, at least for that particular life and production.
How would you compare the show business back when you first started up to now?
Well, let's see.
Basically, I have an idea. At least it would probably be harder then than it is now. But how would you compare in your own words?
Well, it was very confusing to me when I first went to New York from Gary, Indiana, where I was born. I went there at age 19 to seek my fortune. I was tired of working in the steel mills in Gary. And my mother thought that I would probably get buried there if I didn't get out of there and look about and see what else the world had to offer and what I could offer it. And I wound up at the Young Men's Christian Association in Harlem. It's one of the few places where I found that I could find a place to lay my head without any racial preconceptions interfering with my sleep. Across the street was the American Negro Theater, and I was fascinated by the existence of it, but I was not interested in being an actor. I was interested in being a painter.
And you were 19 at the time?
19, yes. Okay. So I went over to see what they were about, and I asked if there was any way that I could join it as an amateur and remain an amateur, and they said yes. Gave me an improvisation to do, and some little article that I'd read in the newspaper, which I shared with them. They said, all right, you seem as if you are reasonably good fodder for training, and so I began studying there, but again, as an amateur with no aim toward becoming a professional.
What would you say was your biggest role at the time you were starting? Maybe 5 years down from age 19, let's say around 24, 25, or 26. What would you say?
About that time, I was conscripted to play the role of God in the revival of the Green Pastures.
How did you feel when you were actually playing the Lord? I mean, basically you were playing a 65-year-old man, weren't you?
No, the Lord's older.
Okay, and at the time you were about 24, 25.
Yes, but
did you always have that baritone type of voice? I mean,
I did try and carry it with me wherever I went.
It's really a muscular voice. And,
a muscular one, eh?
And it's really basically debonair.
Oh, I should hope so.
Oh, yes, it is.
At the time, how did I feel, you asked? Nervous, mostly. That's an enormous responsibility for anyone to take on. The man who portrayed the role of God, or the Lord, as they called him, in the dialect of Louisiana at that time, and the original production, which was 1930 on Broadway, was named Richard B. Harrison, and he was 65. And the play ran for about a year at the Broadhurst Theater, and then toured for about 3.5 years, toured the United States, returned to Broadway, and in a matter of months, Mr. Harrison died from natural causes, I presume. And those who were producing it apparently were monodeists and did not want another god at that time and closed the show. So they looked for another man, I guess, a few years later when they thought a revival might have been timely. And then they began looking each year. They weren't pleased with what they were finding.
How long before they actually...
16 years.
16 years until they got to you.
They got to me, and they didn't really know they'd gotten to me because I had a scraggly little beard at the time, and an even worse suggestion of a mustache. And I think I was 25 at the time. I was appearing in a play called Peter Pan, and I was one of the pirates. Oh. And I was understudying Boris Karloff. Do you know of him?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
And Jean Arthur was portraying Peter Pan. And someone had recommended me to Mark Connolly, who was the author and director of the Green Pastures. And it was after an evening performance that I went to his home, a penthouse off Central Park West in New York. And Connolly was a rather enormous, jovial man. He had the head of a cue ball and jowls. And when he saw me getting off the elevator, he said, "Oh, how could they send you here?
A young man.
How old are you?" I said, 33. 33. He said, why, that's only old enough to play one of the cherubs in the play. He said, what could they have been thinking of? Anyway, he said, well, since you've come in and sit down, and we'll have a look at the play, and you may read the part of God, and I'll read the other parts, and we'll see what's going to happen. He wasn't happy at all. We got through the play, halfway, let's say. And he said, stand up, stand up. And so I stood. He said, well, you got a good build and a nicely shaped head. I mean,
good
it's not
height,
bad.
I might
bad.
say.
Yeah, got a
I believe you're
fairly
about
good voice.
6'5" then?
Yes, then, yes.
But when you played God, you actually played the role God.
I'm afraid so, yes.
Which role would you say out of the years you've been doing acting was most enjoyable? Do you think basically theater is much more enjoyable, or
yes, it is.
Motion picture?
Theater. Motion pictures is very important for a number of reasons, but stage, one feels, I think, much more secure because one has 4 weeks of rehearsal for a drama, generally, for Broadway, right. 6 weeks for a musical, and you have a sense of an interplay with your fellow actors, and you're getting a great deal from very fine theater personnel, you're the producer and director, and you're getting a lot from the audience. They're letting you know whether you're getting over or not. And that doesn't happen in film.
There's no room for mistakes. There's no room for mistakes.
Oh, there's lots of room for it, and a lot of people make them.
I'm pretty sure. Oh, boy. Getting back to times where Boris Karloff, I believe there was some point there you were in horror films. And...
yes, I did. This would have been in 1972. I appeared in a film called Blacula, yes.
That scared me.
Well, it was certainly designed to do so.
And you actually played the part real well.
I thank you.
It was convincing, considering at that time we were just basically used to the regular Dracula, the light skin type. And now here they are showing a different type of a vampire. In different forms, basically. And it was actually, during that time, it was pretty scary. I would actually rate it amongst The Exorcist.
I did an Exorcist film, too, a couple of years after that. It was called Abbey. The same company, American International, produced it. It was sort of a 50 or 75-cent version of The Exorcist.
All right. For those of our fans that used to watch Star Trek, Mr. Marshall also has played in the Star Trek role. And basically, how would you...
Well, this guest stint that I did on Star Trek was a very, very unique story, I thought. It was called The Ultimate Computer. And I played a Dr. Richard Daystrom, a scientist who had been in mothballs for quite some time, and who was invited aboard the Enterprise because he had invented this M5, as they called it, the ultimate computer, and they were going to start staging their war games. And the computer began killing people in these exercises. And of course, Captain Kirk and the rest of the crew were up in arms about this and wanted the creator to do something about it, or they were going to pull the plug on him. And he said, let me speak to it. Don't pull the plug. It's imperative that it continue to live. And he began speaking to it as if it were his own child. Then one realized that he had programmed it with his own engrams, and he'd neglected to inform the computer that killing was immoral. Well, that's a cliffhanger. We'll leave it there. That's how
it's better that way. What was your most fulfilling role?
It's invariably the one you're working on at the time one is asked. And so it's certainly Frederick Douglass. It's a real person and one with whom I can identify with fully, and who has proved himself to be certainly the greatest teacher I've had. I have performed Shakespeare in Europe and in America, and the role of Othello, and was very pleased after having worked on it for a number of years to have Harold Hobson, who was the sort of Dean of Critics in London with the London Sunday Times, say it was the best Othello of our time. So that was very fulfilling, certainly, and very rewarding.
For the younger people that we have out there, what would you basically, if they were to ask you, how would you pursue an acting career, or how would you go about doing it? Just keep pushing?
Well, firstly, let me say I would instruct them to realize that it is a business. And that they must find ways of making themselves marketable. Certainly, keep pushing, keep studying, keep learning one's craft, be ever ready, no matter what your profession, but to try and find some profession other than the entertainment industry in which to make a living, to guarantee it.
Okay.
It's the most heartbreaking industry existent. That is to say, in America or in the West, in other countries that don't have national theaters. I would also suggest that they strive to try and do something about making their congressmen, their councilwomen, the president, the senators, aware of the importance of national theater.
There you are, everyone. You've heard it from Mr. William Marshall. And that wraps up our segment of the Community Access Tonight Show. And my name is Dennis Genablaso with Mr. William Marshall. Have a nice evening.
Good evening.